welcome back. Obviously, a lot more to discuss, and joining me now to do just that in studio, Republican political commentator Brittany Martinez, as well as radio host and political strategist Melik Abdul. And also joining us is former Republican Congressman, former presidential candidate Joe Walsh. Brittany, perhaps I'm just going to start out with you, because I know you were in Milwaukee recently for the Republican National Convention. There's a lot of talk right now, in particular, among people who are perhaps disenfranchised with the Republican Party, but they're also, not too fond of Joe Biden either, so to speak. Do you think now, with it likely being that Kamala Harris could become the nominee, perhaps some of those politically homeless Republicans, so to speak, are more likely to support her, or perhaps less likely?
I'm going to say I do think that there is an opportunity here. One of the things that I think has been the downfall of the Trump campaign so far with those disenfranchised Republicans is that they haven't made an effort to reach out. I think that every vote needs to be earned. And, I was a Nikki Haley supporter in the primary, and there hasn't really been a lot of outreach in that sense. The Biden campaign, they'd been in touch with a lot of the Haley voters on the grassroots level, and I'm sure that the Harris campaign is going to do the same thing. So though maybe we're not politically aligned in the same way, I think that the concern here is that the former president brings a lot of chaos. So perhaps there is an opportunity for the current vice president.
And Melik, let me ask you, because of course, just moments after the announcement was made by President Biden on X, you had the Trump campaign putting out a statement basically linking every single policy failure of the Biden administration and tying that back to Kamala Harris. Is that a negative thing, perhaps an indication that they should pick somebody else who does not carry that same baggage, so to speak?
Well, I was always one of the ones who said initially that it would be very difficult for the Democratic Party not to make Kamala Harris the VP. Now, she has to go through the process, the delegate selection process, just like any other person would, but it does present some difficulties, I would say, for the Trump team. I think that Donald Trump is very bullish on him winning against Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, but where it represents a problem is that race and gender will be a very huge issue in this cycle, and if Donald Trump and Republicans aren't able to navigate that in a way that doesn't get into a lot of the accusations of racism and sexism, Donald Trump will do well. But I think that Republicans who believe that this is just a sure-in, this is Donald Trump's race to lose. I've said that many, many times, and Donald Trump can lose that. And because race and gender will be so potent, they have to be able to have a response to that.
And Joe, let me ask you, because I know that obviously you are a very policy-centered person as well. On policy, you are obviously conservative in many respects, but as it relates to Donald Trump, you've been very outspoken and really ensuring that Donald Trump does not get near the White House again. So I guess my question here is just, are you more enthusiastic about supporting someone like a Kamala Harris as opposed to a Joe Biden now that the cognitive issue kind of goes away and the Republicans aren't able to make any of those arguments? In fact, now it seems as if the Democrats are able to do the reverse and make those arguments about Donald Trump.
Wyatt, I'm more enthused in that now I think the case can be made against Donald Trump. Look, we've known from the beginning, if this election is about Donald Trump, who he is, the threat he is, the lawless, un-American psychopath that he is, if this election is about Trump, Trump loses. Unfortunately, Joe Biden had gotten to a point where he couldn't make that case anymore. And the election was actually becoming about Joe Biden's age and his unfitness. So having a candidate like Kamala Harris in there now, she'll be able to put the focus on Trump, which is really, again, what the focus needs to be. 3.5 years ago, Donald Trump tried to overthrow an American election. I want Kamala Harris talking about that every damn day.
And Joe, let me ask you this too, because obviously now the Democrats can make that argument without sounding hypocritical of their own guy, so to speak. How should the Democrats approach this still from a responsible way that focuses directly on the age and the cognitive concerns of former President Trump, of which there are many? It seemed as if when President Biden was the nominee, they were getting kind of siloed out because it was basically, people were being forced to choose, so to speak, between the lesser of the two.
Look, the American people are not going to believe Donald Trump's too old. That dog ain't going to hunt. What they have to do is talk about how Donald Trump is just bad. He's bad. talk about everything he's done and everything he's said. The other factor here is enthusiasm. We know in America there are more people who oppose Trump than there are people who support him. They need a reason to be excited, though. They didn't have that reason with Joe Biden. I think they'll have that reason with Kamala Harris.
Brittany, do you think there's any world in which, for example, if we look back at 2016, there were a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who weren't necessarily very enthused to vote for someone like Hillary Clinton? As a result, they voted for a third-party candidate like, say, Jill Stein, for example. I mean, is there any world where that kind of happens here? Obviously, third party is a big wild card. You have the likes of RFK Jr. running, and this time more popular than your average third-party candidate. How do you think that will all play out? Do you think Kamala Harris will perhaps attract people who were supporting RFK to her campaign more so than someone like Joe Biden would have?
Well, I definitely think that the vice president is going to be attracting additional voters. So if you look at Joe Biden, for example, when he was in the race, there was a concern that that left-wing side of the party, that they were going to sit this one out. I think that she's going to be able to appeal to some of those voters and bring the base back home. And so I think that is going to be huge for her. Not to mention RFK, sure. I mean, if you look earlier this year, nearly 70% of American voters did not want a Trump-Biden matchup. Now, she's not only had the biggest fundraising in the 24 hours of this election cycle, but she's on track to have the biggest Democrat fundraising of all time. I think that speaks volumes to the voter enthusiasm now compared to when Biden was in the race.
Malik, how do you address that issue of voter enthusiasm? Because we've been used now for so long over the course of this election cycle for there not really being, at least amongst the average majority of Americans, too much enthusiasm for either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. The majority of Americans at the time had said that they really weren't too happy with either one of their options, at least the polls were suggesting. Now that Kamala Harris is the nominee, how much is she going to be able to actually perhaps enthuse crowds, get people excited, something that Joe Biden had a much harder time doing?
So I think that they will be able to capitalize on where Democrats have been successful when it comes to race and gender. I think that they're going to double down on the race and gender. I agree with Joe. Many of these things that are said about Donald Trump, for my purposes, I am actually one of those Bernie voters. I was a two-time Barack Obama voter. I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. And in 2016 in November, Donald Trump was the first Republican I ever voted for. There's been little interest in how did we actually get there. So for me to hear Democrats, as they're most certainly going to do, paint Donald Trump as a racist. I remember what the late John Lewis said about not just John McCain, but Mitt Romney, likening them to George Wallace and segregationists. In 2012, it was Joe Biden who said, before an audience of black people, that the Republican Party wants to put us back in chains. So the notion that somehow Democrats will be able to run a successful election based on a Republican, even though we're talking about Donald Trump being racist, it is something that we've heard over and over again. And as a black voter, it's something that I've heard over and over again. But Republicans are going to have to be careful, as I said, in how they wage this election against Kamala Harris, because it won't just be a cakewalk. Race and gender will factor very heavily into this election cycle. And if Donald Trump embraces some of those on the far right wings, and I would even argue like a Charlie Kirk and some of this DEI language that they've been actually using, if Donald Trump embraces that, he will lose the election. But I think absent that, Donald Trump, a more disciplined Donald Trump, that's someone who can win in November.
I will go to Joe in a second, but as it relates to some of the claims that he's been making about the 2020 election, as it relates to January 6th, if his messaging stays on that, you think it's the same thing? You think he might have a harder time? Because, of course, that rallies his base, but to the average American who's kind of oblivious to these claims, rightly so, given that they aren't based in facts, how does it kind of play into the dynamics of his campaign?
Well, what we've seen with Donald Trump, he's begun to actually move away from consistently talking about the 2020 election. I think that most people understand Donald Trump has been impeached twice. Donald Trump had four
Indictments.
Yeah, 4 indictments. He has a conviction under his belt. All of these things will be used against Donald Trump. But again, I still believe that there are opportunities there for Donald Trump. He's going to have a very difficult time navigating this because the Republican Party has, in many of the elements on the right, have made it very difficult, even for people like me. But I think that the opportunity is there, and the notion that somehow Kamala Harris Harris expands the electorate. I think that Kamala Harris will excite the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, the members of her sorority, and many other black people in that. But if you look at the polling, she's not going to galvanize black people in the way that they were, and that's going to be a factor in this election.
Joe, let me just conclude with you. How do the Republicans balance, and I guess how do the Democrats balance, even to some degree, talking about the election lies that the former president was spreading and what have you, January 6th, informing people of the importance of that, as I know you and Brittany did an event in Milwaukee, for example, talking about some of that, versus focusing on the policy issues? Because, of course, you have to play kind of that line. A lot of Americans don't know a lot about some of the claims that the former president has made. Rather, you know, they're just kind of the average day-to-day person focused on the grocery bill. So from a political strategy standpoint, how do you balance the two?
You talk about both, and you push both, and you have enough respect for the American people that they can give a damn about the price of groceries and give a damn about their democracy. You remind every single voter this year that Donald Trump is the only president who lost an election and refused to concede. Damn it, that matters, and you pound that home. Look, here's the difference, Wyatt. If Kamala Harris loses in November, Kamala Harris will accept the will of the people and Kamala will concede. If Donald Trump loses in November, he won't and he won't. We talk about a threat to democracy all the time. That's the threat. So you can't normalize Trump. Yeah, you have to talk about issues that matter to the American people, but doggone it, if democracy doesn't matter, then, hey, we're sunk anyways.
All right, we will leave our conversation there. That is Joe Walsh, Brittany Martinez, and Melik Abdul. Thank you all so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. We'll be right back.